Major James Anderson stood rigid, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides as the broadcast filled the airwaves of the command center. The room, a hub of grim efficiency, was unnervingly silent save for the guttural tones of the alien announcer and the flickering holographic projection. Rows of officers watched, their faces taut with rage and helplessness. On the screen, a pale, broken figure knelt beneath the cruel glow of alien floodlights. Captain David Grant's face, battered but defiant, was unmistakable. His Marine insignia, dulled and scuffed, was still visible on his torn uniform. Beside him stood a towering Zorthian executor, its segmented exoskeleton reflecting the light with an unholy sheen. In the background, the Galactic Council emblem, a swirling galaxy encased by the talons of a predator, loomed ominously. "This," boomed the alien announcer, its voice a metallic drone translated into dozens of Earth languages, "is the fate of all who defy the Council's dominion. Humanity will kneel or be eradicated." Anderson's jaw tightened, the veins in his neck pulsing. He had seen enough propaganda from the Galactic Council, but this was different. This wasn't posturing or veiled threats. This was a live execution. The screen shifted to Grant's face, his one unswollen eye locking onto the camera. "To my brothers and sisters on Earth," Grant said, his voice hoarse but unbroken, "we are not defeated. Do not let this scare you into submission. Fight! Humanity must survive." The executor raised its plasma blade, a blade that shimmered with energy capable of reducing flesh and bone to ash. The room collectively held its breath. The blade swung. The screen went black. The silence in the command center was deafening, broken only by the sharp hiss of Anderson's breath. Around him, officers turned away from their stations, some muttering curses, others silently lowering their heads in grief. Anderson took a deliberate step forward, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "General Cole," he said, his tone barely contained fury, "we cannot stand by any longer. That was a Marine, one of our own. They executed him like a rabid animal." Across the room, General Thaddeus Cole sat behind a polished steel table, his expression carved from stone. His graying hair and deep-set eyes gave him an air of authority that few dared challenge. He clasped his hands together, the movement slow and deliberate. "We're aware of the situation, Major," Cole said, his voice a deep rumble. "But rushing into action would be playing into their hands. They want us to react emotionally. We have to think strategically." "Strategically?" Anderson spat, his voice rising. "With all due respect, sir, they just executed Captain Grant in front of the entire galaxy. How many more of our people need to die before we act? How many messages do they need to send before we send one back?" Cole's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Lieutenant Marcus Vance, Anderson's trusted second-in-command, stepped closer, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Anderson's barely restrained fury. "Sir, Major Anderson isn't wrong," Vance said. "The Council's trying to break us. Every second we delay is a second they consolidate their control. If we let this slide, we'll look weak." Cole leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what do you propose, Major?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That we launch an all-out assault on their prison stations? Risk Earth's entire defense for a handful of soldiers?" Anderson stepped closer to the table, his gaze unwavering. "I propose we show them that humanity doesn't roll over. We don't need an army. We need a team. Give me a handful of Marines and the USS Vindicator. We'll get our people back and send a message of our own." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Anderson's words hung heavy in the air, the weight of his resolve unmistakable. Cole's eyes darted to the hologram that had resumed on a nearby screen, replaying the Galactic Council's propaganda on a loop. He let out a slow breath, the lines on his face deepening. "You're asking for an unauthorized mission, Major," Cole said, his voice low. "One that, if discovered, could plunge us into full-scale war." Anderson's voice was steady, his gaze unflinching. "Sir, war's already here. The Council declared at the moment they started executing our people. We either fight now, or we kneel later. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, every officer awaiting Cole's response. Finally, the general exhaled heavily and gestured to a nearby technician. "Cut the feed," he ordered. The hologram vanished, leaving the room in a dim glow. Cole turned his attention back to Anderson, his gaze piercing. "You'll have your team, Major, but this is on you. You fail, and Earth won't come for you. Is that clear?" Anderson nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Crystal clear, sir." As Cole dismissed the room, Anderson turned to Vance, who had already begun tapping on his wrist communicator. "Assemble the team," Anderson said. "We leave within the hour." Vance nodded. "Boomer's already on standby. Cross is running simulations in the tech lab. They'll be ready." Anderson allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. His team wasn't just capable. They were the best Earth had to offer. If anyone could pull off the impossible, it was them. But as he exited the command center, the weight of the mission pressed down on him. This wasn't just about saving prisoners. This was about humanity's survival. The Galactic Council had drawn a line in the sand. Anderson was about to show them what happened when they crossed it. The sleek silhouette of the USS Vindicator hovered in the darkness of space, its matte black hull absorbing the faint light of distant stars. Inside the ship's cramped interior, Major James Anderson stood in the center of the briefing room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his team. Each man wore the weight of the mission differently, but the determination was the same. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a message to the Galactic Council that humanity wouldn't bow. Sergeant Alex Boomer Monroe leaned back in his seat, his broad shoulders stretching the limits of his combat armor. "So, let me get this straight," Boomer said, his voice a low rumble with a hint of amusement. "We're sneaking into the most heavily fortified prison station in the galaxy with nothing but a stealth ship, some fancy gadgets, and a plan that hinges on Cross not tripping any alarms." Private First Class Ivan Cross, the youngest and greenest member of the team, bristled. "Hey, I've run simulations all week. Their system architecture is outdated compared to ours. I've got this." His fingers tapped nervously on the datapad in front of him, but his eyes burned with the kind of youthful confidence that hadn't yet been tempered by the realities of combat. Anderson stepped forward, silencing the exchange with a pointed look. "This isn't a debate," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We have one shot at this. We slip in, get our people, and get out. No unnecessary risks. If anyone's unsure, speak now." Lieutenant Marcus Vance, seated to Anderson's right, crossed his arms and leaned forward. "We're with you, Major. Always." His voice was calm, measured, a sharp contrast to Boomer's irreverence and Cross's eager energy. Vance had been with Anderson through countless missions, and his steady presence was as much a weapon as his sniper rifle. Anderson nodded, a flicker of gratitude passing through his stern features. "Good. Here's the plan." He activated the holographic display in the center of the table, projecting the schematics of the Galactic Council prison station. The structure was a sprawling lattice of metal and biotechnological components, orbiting a volatile red dwarf star. Dozens of patrol ships and automated turrets circled the station like predators guarding a carcass. The prison's primary weakness is its reliance on centralized control, Anderson explained, highlighting key areas on the hologram. Cross will breach their outer security grid and give us a window to dock unnoticed. From there, we move through these maintenance corridors. He pointed to a series of narrow shafts snaking through the station. They're unmonitored but tight. Once inside, we split into two teams. Vance and I will locate the prisoners. Boomer and Cross handle extraction and ensure we have a way out. Boomer grinned, his scarred face lighting up with a dangerous gleam. "And by handle extraction, you mean blow things up if we need to, right?" Anderson allowed himself the faintest smirk. "Only if absolutely necessary." The briefing ended, and the team dispersed to prepare. In the armory, Anderson strapped on his combat gear, the weight of the armor familiar and grounding. Vance approached, adjusting the scope on his sniper rifle. "You think this is going to work?" Vance asked quietly, his tone devoid of doubt but heavy with concern. Anderson met his gaze. "It has to. We don't have the luxury of failure." The ship jolted slightly as they entered the prison station's vicinity. Anderson made his way to the cockpit, where Cross was hunched over the control panel, his fingers flying across the console. The faint glow of holographic screens illuminated his focused expression. "We're approaching the perimeter," Cross announced, his voice steady despite the tension. "I'm initiating the cloaking protocol now." The Vindicator shimmered briefly before vanishing from sight, its stealth systems engaging flawlessly. Anderson placed a hand on the back of Cross's chair, watching the station loom closer on the view screen. "Any signs they've noticed us?" Anderson asked. "None," Cross replied, his confidence returning. "Their detection grid is outdated, just like I said. We're invisible." Boomer's voice crackled over the comms. "Let's hope their brains are as outdated as their tech." The Vindicator slipped into a docking port concealed beneath the station, its engines humming softly as they powered down. The team gathered at the airlock, their weapons locked and loaded. Anderson took one last look at his men, the grim determination in their eyes matching his own. "Remember," Anderson said, his voice firm, "this is a precision mission. No unnecessary noise, no unnecessary risks. We stick to the plan." The airlock hissed open, revealing the dimly lit maintenance corridor. The walls were lined with pulsating conduits, the alien technology alive with an eerie glow. The air was cold and sterile, carrying a faint metallic tang. The team moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the rubberized soles of their boots. Cross took point, his datapad scanning for security nodes. Behind him, Boomer carried a compact demolition pack, his fingers twitching with anticipation. They reached the first junction, a narrow intersection where the maintenance corridor branched off into several smaller shafts. Cross paused, his brow furrowing as he studied the readout on his datapad. "There's a patrol moving through the adjacent corridor," he whispered. 5 hostiles armed. If we wait 20 seconds, they'll pass." Anderson motioned for the team to hold position. The muffled clatter of alien footsteps grew louder, then faded as the patrol passed. Once the coast was clear, Anderson signaled for them to move. They continued deeper into the station, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the station and the prisoners. At a secondary junction, Anderson raised a fist, bringing the team to a halt. "Vance with me," he ordered. "Boomer, Cross, hold this position and be ready for extraction." Boomer gave a mock salute. "You got it, boss. Don't take too long. I get antsy." Anderson and Vance moved down the narrower shaft, their movements precise and deliberate. The corridor opened into a small observation chamber overlooking the prison blocks. Below them, rows of cells lined a massive chamber, each one containing a single occupant. Most of the prisoners were human, their faces gaunt but defiant. Anderson scanned the cells, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Captain Grant in one of the farthest cells. The man was alive but visibly weakened, his movements sluggish. "There he is," Anderson said. "Let's move." As they descended a spiral staircase leading to the cell block, an alarm blared, the harsh sound reverberating through the station. Anderson's comm crackled to life. Major?" Cross's voice was strained. "We've got a problem. Their system just triggered an internal sweep. They know someone's here." "Then we stick to the plan," Anderson replied. "Get that extraction route ready." The mission had just gotten infinitely more complicated, but Anderson felt no hesitation. They had come too far to turn back now. He motioned for Vance to cover him as they approached Grant's cell, the weight of the mission pressing heavier with every second. The alarm's shrill wail echoed through the prison chamber, red lights bathing the metallic walls in an ominous glow. Major James Anderson tightened his grip on his rifle, his sharp gaze darting across the rows of cells. The mission was unraveling faster than he anticipated, but the goal remained clear: Retrieve Captain Grant and as many prisoners as possible. Lieutenant Marcus Vance crouched beside him, sniper rifle trained on the far entrance. "We've got company inbound," Vance murmured, his voice steady despite the tension. "Movement on the upper level. I count 6, maybe 7. Hold them off," Anderson ordered, his voice low but commanding. "I'll get Grant." Anderson moved swiftly to the reinforced cell, his boots thudding against the grated floor. Grant was slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow but rhythmic. The Marine's face was bruised, his uniform torn, but his eyes open at the sound of Anderson's voice. "Captain Grant," Anderson said, scanning the locking mechanism on the cell door. "We're getting you out of here." Grant's lips curved into a faint smile. "Took you long enough," he rasped, his voice weak but threaded with a stubborn defiance. "Thought maybe Earth forgot about us." "Not a chance," Anderson replied, his tone firm. He motioned to Cross through his comms. "Cross, I need the cell open now." "Working on it, Major," Cross responded, the sound of furious typing audible over the line. "Their system's fighting me, but I've almost got it." Above, the clatter of approaching boots grew louder. Vance adjusted his aim, his breath measured as he fired a precise shot. The first alien guard crumpled silently to the floor. A second hesitated, only to meet the same fate. "Nice shooting," Anderson muttered, his focus on the door. "How much longer, Cross?" 10 seconds, Cross said, his voice tight. "Maybe 15. "Don't rush me." Boomer's voice crackled over the comms. "Take your time, kid. It's not like we're pinned down or anything." "Boomer, what's your status?" Anderson asked. "Setting up a nice little surprise for our friends," Boomer replied, his tone laced with dark humor. "They won't like what's coming." The cell door hissed open, its hydraulics whining in protest. Anderson stepped inside, kneeling beside Grant and pulling him to his feet. "Can you walk?" Anderson asked, his tone more demand than question. "Does it matter?" Grant grunted, leaning heavily on Anderson as they moved toward the exit. More guards poured into the chamber, their insect-like exoskeletons glinting under the red lights. Vance took out 2 more, but the remaining enemies returned fire, their plasma rounds striking dangerously close. "Boomer, now would be a good time for that surprise," Anderson barked. A deafening explosion shook the chamber, sending shards of metal and alien bodies flying. Smoke billowed from the upper level as Boomer's charges detonated, cutting off reinforcements. "Surprise delivered," Boomer said, satisfaction dripping from his voice. Anderson hauled Grant toward the extraction point, Vance covering their retreat with relentless precision. The remaining prisoners, galvanized by the sudden chaos, began shouting and pounding on their cell doors. "We can't leave them," Grant said, his voice strained but resolute. "These men deserve a chance." Anderson hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Cross, how fast can you open the rest of the cells?" "Fast isn't exactly in the cards right now, Major," Cross replied. "The system's on full lockdown. I'll need at least 2 minutes." "You've got 1, Anderson said. "Do it." Cross muttered a curse under his breath, but began working, his fingers flying over his datapad. Anderson and Vance held their ground, fending off waves of guards while prisoners poured out of their cells, many grabbing discarded weapons from fallen aliens. "Grant, get these men organized," Anderson ordered. "They follow us, no stragglers." Grant nodded, his movements sluggish but purposeful as he rallied the freed prisoners. The group moved through the maze-like corridors, every turn punctuated by firefights and narrow escapes. Boomer brought up the rear, planting charges to cover their retreat. As they approached the docking bay, Cross's voice crackled urgently over the comms. "Major, we've got a big problem. Their security AI has locked onto us. It's rerouting all remaining guards to our location. Then we're out of time," Anderson replied. "Boomer, detonate the charges. We need a clear path." "On it," Boomer said. Moments later, the station shook with another series of explosions. The smoke and debris bought them precious seconds, but Anderson knew it wouldn't last. The group reached the docking bay, where the USS Vindicator waited with its ramp extended. Cross stood at the ship's entrance, frantically waving them in. "Hurry up," he shouted. One by one, the prisoners boarded, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. Anderson and Vance covered the rear, their weapons blazing as the final guards closed in. "Everyone's on board," Cross yelled. "Go, go, go," Anderson ordered, pulling Vance up the ramp as the ship's engines roared to life. The ramp sealed behind them, and the Vindicator lurched into motion, its thrusters propelling them away from the station. Inside the cramped cabin, the freed prisoners slumped against the walls, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Grant sat beside Anderson, his breathing heavy but steady. "You didn't have to come for us," Grant said quietly. "But you did. Thank you." Anderson didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the viewport as the station grew smaller in the distance. Finally, he said, "We don't leave our own behind." Before Grant could reply, a faint hum filled the cabin, growing louder. Vance frowned, moving to the cockpit. "Incoming ships," he reported grimly. "Looks like the Council isn't letting us go without a fight." The Vindicator shuddered as enemy ships opened fire. Anderson gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but surrender wasn't an option. "Cross, can you scramble their targeting systems?" Anderson asked. "I'll try," Cross said, his hands flying over the controls. "But it won't hold for long." Boomer strapped himself into a gunner's seat, his grin fierce. "Good thing we don't need long." As the Vindicator weaved through enemy fire, Grant leaned closer to Anderson, his voice low but urgent. "There's something you need to know," he said. "The Council isn't just targeting soldiers. They're planning to wipe out entire human colonies. They see us as a threat, one they need to eliminate completely." Anderson's jaw tightened, the weight of Grant's words sinking in. This mission wasn't just about saving lives. It was about survival. Humanity was facing extinction, and the fight had only just begun. "We'll deal with that," Anderson said, his voice steel. "But first, let's get out of here alive." As the Vindicator banked hard to avoid another barrage, Anderson locked eyes with Vance. The mission wasn't over. If anything, it was only the beginning. The USS Vindicator jolted violently as another volley of plasma fire grazed its hull. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in a blood-red glow. An alarm screamed through the ship's narrow corridors. Major James Anderson braced himself against the bulkhead, his hand gripping a support rail as he steadied his footing. Every second they remained in the enemy's sights brought them closer to obliteration. "Status report," Anderson barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Lieutenant Marcus Vance leaned over the cockpit console, his sharp eyes scanning the data flooding the monitors. "Shields are at 30%, Vance said grimly. "We've got 2 frigates on our tail and a squadron of fighters closing fast. Cross, I need that targeting scramble now." Anderson shouted. Private Ivan Cross's fingers danced frantically over the controls. "I'm working on it, Major," he snapped, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Their systems are adapting faster than I expected. I just need—" "Got it." The hum of the enemy ship's targeting arrays faltered, and for a brief moment the hostile fire ceased. Boomer, strapped into one of the dorsal gunner stations, let out a triumphant roar. "Nice work, Cross," Boomer yelled, swiveling his turret toward the pursuing fighters. "Let's see how they like a taste of their own medicine." The Vindicator's rear-mounted cannons blazed, sending a hail of projectiles into the void. 2 enemy fighters disintegrated in flashes of blue fire, their debris scattering into the darkness. But the respite was short-lived. The frigates adjusted their formation, flanking the Vindicator and unleashing another barrage. The ship lurched again, sparks raining from the overhead panels. "We're not going to last much longer like this," Vance shouted. Anderson's mind raced. They were too far from Earth's defenses to call for backup, and the frigates were closing the distance with ruthless precision. Their only chance was a debris field from a long-abandoned mining operation that floated just ahead, a maze of derelict structures and asteroid fragments. "Pilot, take us into the debris field," Anderson ordered. "We'll use it for cover." Cross glanced back, his eyes wide. "Are you serious? That place is a death trap. Less so than staying out here," Anderson replied sharply. "Do it." The Vindicator banked hard, diving into the chaotic expanse of jagged metal and drifting rock. The hostile ships hesitated at the edge of the field, their pilots calculating the risks of pursuit. Boomer's laughter crackled over the comms. "What's the matters?" Boomer taunted. "Afraid of a few rocks." The reprieve gave the crew a moment to regroup, but Anderson knew it wouldn't last. He turned to Captain Grant, who sat strapped into a nearby seat, his face pale but resolute. "Grant, you mentioned the Council's plan to target human colonies," Anderson said. "How much do you know?" "Enough to know we're running out of time," Grant replied, his voice low but steady. "The Council sees us as a threat, not because of our military, but because of our resilience. They want to break us before we can unify against them." Anderson absorbed the words, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. "Then this mission isn't just about survival," he said. "It's about sending a message." Vance's voice broke through the intercom. "Major, we've got movement. The frigates are entering the field." Anderson's jaw tightened. The enemy's hesitation had evaporated, and their determination to eliminate the Vindicator was evident. "Cross, plot the fastest course out of here," Anderson ordered. "Boomer, keep them off us as long as you can." "Fastest course means tight maneuvering," Cross warned. "If I miscalculate by even a fraction—" "Don't miscalculate," Anderson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The Vindicator weaved through the treacherous field, its hull skimming dangerously close to jagged debris. Boomer's cannons thundered, taking out another fighter, but the frigates pressed on, their larger size affording them an advantage in firepower. Anderson grabbed the comms. "Vance, give me options." "Option 1. We keep running and pray their luck runs out before ours does," Vance replied. "Option 2. We detonate part of the debris field and hope it takes them out." "And option 3? Anderson asked. Vance hesitated. "There isn't one." Anderson turned to Boomer. "Can you set charges remotely?" Boomer's grin was audible through the comms. "Can I?" "Major, I already did." "Do it," Anderson said. The ship's sensors registered a massive explosion as Boomer's charges detonated, sending a wave of debris hurtling toward the pursuing frigates. One managed to veer away, but the other took a direct hit, its shields failing as a shard of metal tore through its hull. The remaining frigate pulled back, its captain clearly reevaluating the pursuit. The Vindicator broke free of the debris field, the vast emptiness of space stretching out before them. Cross let out a shaky breath. "We're clear," he said. "No hostiles on sensors." A wave of relief swept through the crew, but Anderson remained tense. The cost of the mission weighed heavily on him, and the knowledge of the Council's plans made it clear their fight was far from over. In the quiet that followed, Anderson addressed the freed prisoners. "You've been through hell," he said, "but you're not alone. Humanity doesn't abandon its own, and we won't stop fighting for you." Grant stood, his movements slow but purposeful. "The Council thinks they can break us," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "But they don't understand what it means to be human. We endure, we resist, and when we strike back, we don't just survive, we thrive." The crew erupted into quiet cheers, their spirits bolstered by Grant's words. Anderson allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, but his mind was already on what came next. The Council's threat loomed larger than ever, and the survival of Earth and its colonies would depend on what they did now. Anderson turned to Vance. "Get us back to Earth. We have a lot of work to do." As the Vindicator sped toward home, its crew battered but unbroken, Anderson knew one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning.